Hello and welcome to Comics Secret History. My name is Mikey Crotty. The purpose of this channel is to present the actual facts around famous or infamous events in recent-ish comics history, in an effort to balance the overwhelmingly false narratives that perpetuate comics journalism and media. So I hope you'll enjoy. This particular piece unravels some of Alan Moore's invented history and definitively reveals, for pretty much the first time, why he stopped Marvel reprinting Captain Britain, why he resolved never to work with Marvel, except for when he did, and no, I'm not talking about the famine benefit comic, why he and his closest, most prolific co-creator Alan Davis fell out, the only actual time in Moore's history where a creator's work was stolen and swindled, and Moore's role in it. Exactly how deceptively complex his infamous Watchmen contract was, why his narrative about the Watchmen contract is a lie, why he actually attacks comics and their film adaptations, and you'll see it's actually only DC's that he attacks, his own history of respect for his precious creators' rights, which acclaimed Moore-owned series would never exist except for Steve Bissette, why almost a dozen comic creators can't reprint their creator-owned work because it was written by Moore, which comic book creator went to their grave, prevented from seeing reprint fees from their work, thanks to Alan Moore, which beloved comic writer did Alan Moore lie about after his death to prop up another of his lies? How did Alan Moore credit or acknowledge the original creators of characters he used in his creator-owned books or authors of novels he adapted? And which Moore co-creator spent the pandemic working a factory night shift because Moore wouldn't allow his name to appear on their creator-owned work to bolster sales? I'd like to thank in particular the kindness and generosity of Alan Davis, Steve Bissette, David Lloyd, Don Simpson, and Des Skin for all their assistance in unraveling the truth. Alan Moore is the most famous and respected comic writer in the world today. His work on titles such as Watchmen, V for Vendetta, From Hell, and many others have elevated the medium as well as generating a slew of cinematic adaptations. Despite the enduring success, influence, and critical acclaim the comics media afforded him, Moore has spent almost the last 2 decades condemning the medium, its publishers, employees, and even audience, and he gives a very good reason for this. He's repeatedly stated publicly that television and cinematic adaptations diminish the original work, and that he was, and this is in quotes, folks, swindled and stolen of his creations and his creators' rights by crooked contracts from unscrupulous gangster corporations who never valued or respected the creators producing the work. Unsurprisingly, a lot of people support his stance, but the truth is it's utterly contrived to garner sympathy and support for a very personal, petty vendetta. It has no basis in fact, and is completely contrary actually to how Moore himself has always behaved and mistreated his fellow peers, creators, and colleagues. Moore's self-written history is a fictional reimagining of reality, emboldened by all the interviews, articles, and biographies that echo it across the world. Like most of his celebrated works, it involves intricately described imagined chronology and events, evocative and emotive language and metaphors and twists and turns, invisible at the start but delicately planted and nurtured, apparent at the end, rewarding subsequent rereads. In this particular Moore tale, the victim is revealed to be the villain, all his imagined abuses actually visited deliberately by him on others, stealing from closest collaborators, erasing other creators' contributions to his own work, and even damaging colleagues' careers and livelihoods as collateral. Even the co-creators of his most famous works, who've never openly contradicted his lies, have been repeatedly defamed by him and their reputations damaged, simply because they haven't publicly supported his very personal vendettas. He even suggests comics are responsible for infantilizing the readers, as well as the election of Donald Trump. Before dismissing that as sarcasm or humor, as his supporters suggest, In other recent interviews, he's also hilariously suggested the Ku Klux Klan were the inspiration behind superheroes and that the Mafia created the comics industry. He is now thankfully working in the more genteel and nobler film industry, having cut his teeth working on an abandoned Electric Comics project with Hewlett-Packard, whose very publicized dalliances with fraud, bribery, and human rights violation didn't deter him from setting up with them. A self-proclaimed anarchist, Moore wrote about his personal philosophy in 2010 in his own magazine, which he edited and published, Dodgem Logic. This cooperation between individuals who may not share the same opinion, this ability to recognize and to respect the fact that others have as much right to determine their own lives as we have, is in my opinion necessary for any form of anarchy. And he wrote, in accepting sole responsibility for how your life unfolds, you cease to be life's victim and begin to realize the unexpected power you have over your circumstances, without ever seeking to exert power over others, without effing anybody over. Contrary to his avowed belief, however, Moore has always dictated what his peers can and cannot do, with work they co-created and co-own with him, and he consistently blames others for his own misfortunes. In his most recent interview in 2020 with Deadline magazine, he once again eviscerated the industry that made him a star. All of these characters have been stolen from their original creators. All of them. They have a long line of ghosts standing behind them. The stark facts, however, are that these actions are applicable only to Moore, not the companies that employed him. For 35 years, he has been crafting his own origin story, featuring the work and co-creations of his friends and peers without their consent. Now, for the first time, some of the most important artists and seminal co-creators in Moore's tale finally illuminate their own chapters. HBO's 2019 Watchmen series, a sequel to the acclaimed 1985 comic series, was lauded by critics and audiences alike, sweeping the Emmy Awards and even featuring on Barack Obama's Best of 2019 list. This was even more impressive, given the public statements by family, friends, and fans of Moore's, supporting boycotting the series and parroting his declaration that his creations were stolen and swindled from him. The HBO series creator Damon Lindelof spoke in several interviews about how the guilt and angst he felt as a result of Moore's claims almost killed the project, and he's announced he will not work on the series in the future. In November 2019, Moore's daughter and fellow writer Leah Moore tweeted a long missive regarding the morality of the HBO series, writing of her father. His problem was that the medium he adored was ruled by corrupt despots, that the people who made the magic were abused, that their contribution was not valued, that it was stolen from them. He already hated that before Watchmen. So when it happened to him, and then again, it wasn't just a business deal gone awry or a bit of bad luck. It broke him. His son-in-law, John Reppion, also a writer, continued the family's tales of tragic theft, subsequently tweeting, "Everyone please stop saying they think Alan Moore would probably actually love the new Watchmen TV series. It's like saying you think someone would really like what the burglars did with the furniture they stole." Even Moore's most famous protege, the respected author Neil Gaiman, chimed in, tweeting to his millions of followers, "I'm not watching it. It might be brilliant, but the taste in my mouth over Watchmen and how Alan was treated is too unpleasant, I'm afraid." Gaiman is currently working with the company that treated Moore so unpleasantly on several projects. Ironically, these supporters' tweets, while in no way reflective of the facts concerning DC Warner Brothers' treatment of him over Watchmen, are pretty much perfect when it comes to how Moore personally treated its precursor, Marvel Miracle Man co-creator artist Alan Davis, and at the same time that he was signing his Watchmen contract. Marvel Man, later renamed Miracle Man for the US market, like Watchmen, was an ultra-modern reimagining and realistic take on a classic superhero from vintage comics. Moore's fictional victimization is actually relatively recent, given the 1985 genesis of Watchmen comics, and it only went mainstream in 2006 in the wake of the V for Vendetta film, based on his and artist David Lloyd's work. For almost the first 20 years of having signed his contract for Watchmen, Moore had little if few public complaints about it. This changed in an interview with the New York Times' David Itzkoff, again in 2006, where he publicly launched his rebooted history to the media. "They were stolen from me, knowingly stolen from me. In Mr. Moore's account of his career, the villains are clearly defined. They are the mainstream comics industry, particularly DC Comics. Mr. Moore says he was objecting to language in his contracts that would give him back the rights to Watchmen and V for Vendetta when they went out of print. Language that he says turned out to be meaningless because DC never intended to stop reprinting either book. I said, fair enough," he recalls. "You have managed to successfully swindle me, and so I will never work for you again." This false narrative regarding his Watchmen's contract's standard rights reversion clause is the one Moore and his supporters have stuck to ever since, and reiterated dozens of times across the media. "It's a bit rich that they should have lied through their teeth and swindled me out of me rights to it. DC had stolen it from us and they weren't going to give it back," he said in an interview with Kurt Amaker in 2012. In 2014, Moore told the BBC, "I can no longer work within the comics industry. This is the gangster ethics that I was just talking about, after seeing great creators going to their graves, cheated and disillusioned." Observers questioned how somebody who casually demonstrates a genius level of retention, recollection, and understanding of the intricacies of everything from prehistoric practices to cutting-edge quantum theory would be so ignorant of standard reversion clauses in the most important contract he ever signed. Moore has an explanation for that, saying in numerous interviews that he'd never seen a contract before. He never properly read it or even got a solicitor to look at it for 25 years. Now, I've since seen the Watchmen contract, which obviously we didn't read very closely at the time. It was the first contract that I'd ever seen, and I believe that it was a relatively rare event for a contract to actually exist in the comics business. Despite his regularly proclaimed anarchist beliefs, Moore has never made any of his contract public or produced any evidence whatsoever to support any of his repeated derogatory references to it. A throwaway quote has been seized by Moore's fans and some comics reporters as proof that DC swindled them. Asked in 1986 while promoting the Watchmen trade paperback if he owned the characters, Moore said, "My understanding is that when Watchmen is finished and DC have not used the characters for a year, they're ours." However, Dave Gibbons then quickly interjected to clarify the nature of what is a standard reversion clause. They pay a substantial amount of money, which led Moore to row back on owning the characters then or at any fixed period in the future, saying, "Basically, they're not ours. But if DC is working with the characters in our interest, then they might as well be. On the other hand, if the characters have outlived their natural lifespan and DC doesn't want to do anything with them, then after a year we've got them, and we can do what we want with them, which I'm perfectly happy with." There was no reference to going out of print or a year after printing that is synonymous with reporting on the contract today. Some ignorant or deliberately deceptive supporters have even stated that comic series collections or graphic novels did not exist to be sold in bookstores in 1986. This is patently not true. British mainstream bookshops were full of perennial reprint collections or graphic novels, from Rupert the Bear to Tintin to Asterix to 2000 AD albums that sold for years and decades at that time. And the market was even more prevalent in Europe and in America, where Will Eisner had been publishing graphic novels since the 70s. Titan UK, who would go on to publish the Watchmen trade paperback in the UK, had been publishing reprints since 1981. There were approximately 10 Judge Dredd collections and 9 2000 AD collections already in the shops around the time Moore was signing his Watchmen contract. And Moore was at the signings for these trade paperback collections years before he signed the Watchmen contract, when, according to his supporters, they didn't exist until the success of Watchmen. Moore himself was actually very aware of the potential revenue of these reprint collections. As far back as 1983, he spoke in a Fantasy Express interview about the monies to be made by reprinting albums collecting his stories. Regardless of the lies concerning the contract and even the marketplace that Moore and his supporters propagate, the fact remains that Moore was meeting with film producers and merchandisers, which would have ensured Watchmen's IP value right up until 2000, when he was working for DC on a new edition and toys to ensure the brand's value to DC well into the new millennium. Moore's supposed naive ignorance concerning contracts being on a par with ignorant fans and non-journalistic comic site journalists doesn't even stand up to the most cursory scrutiny. It depends on his co-creators, who also signed these contracts, being equally ignorant or gullible. His Watchmen co-creator, artist Dave Gibbons, however, has never complained about DC's contract, let alone publicly accused DC of swindling or stealing from him, while his V for Vendetta co-creator, artist David Lloyd, has stated that he is very happy with the results of what DC have done with it. I have no complaints. Moore himself even undermined his current ignorance excuses as early as 1986, when he referred to specific minor contract details in a then famous row with DC about whether Watchmen pin badges were promotional or a merchandise item which he would profit from, when he was first promoting the book. The issue was resolved by DC quickly in Moore's favor. Remember, he now states he didn't look at the contract closely for 25 years. In fact, Moore was actually very contract savvy at the time of signing his Watchmen contract in 1985. He had been a member of the Society of Strip Illustration for several years. The SSI was an organization for professionals in the comic strip industry that met regularly in London, both socially and for networking, and formally for lectures, discussions, and newsletter articles on copyright, syndication, and contracts. V for Vendetta artist David Lloyd was even chairman of the society, while Moore worked with him at the same time that he was signing his DC contracts. Despite all the interviews he's given as the victim of a duplicitous contract that he never looked at, except for when he did regarding the Watchmen badges, Moore was actually already adept in contracts, copyrights, and creators' rights, as he proved in 1984 when he was amending contracts concerning the copyright and ownership of Marvel Man for himself and his colleagues. He also showcased his comprehensive knowledge of the industry's contracts in a letter he sent in September 1984 to Marvel UK's managing director and publisher Robert Sutherland. Moore sent the letter on both his and co-creator Alan Davis's behalf, though without consulting or even informing Alan Davis. And it was regarding their contracts for Marvel UK, clarifying specifically their creators' rights and reprints regarding copyright and the irrelevance of any verbal agreement under British copyright law. In the same letter, he generously also offered to provide any additional information Sutherland might require to clear up any confusion he might have had over contractual rights and copyright laws. Though Moore wrote the letter as if it was from himself and Alan Davis, again, he never consulted with or informed Alan Davis about it. This was a year before he now states the Watchmen contract was the first he'd ever seen. 3 creators essentially signed the Watchmen contract, and 2 of them, Gibbons and Lloyd, who Moore says he convinced to sign the same deal for V for Vendetta, despite now stating he never properly read the contract, have never had any issue with it. V for Vendetta co-creator David Lloyd's current recollection contradicts Moore's many accounts. I have no memory of Alan selling me a Watchmen contract. It was just what we were presented with as co-owners, and I accepted it in full knowledge of the reversion clause. And that the contract was clear enough to me and was accepted by me at the time that it was signed, and it seemed similarly fine by Alan. Lloyd doesn't recall Moore ever communicating any concerns over the contract with him, despite subsequently regularly attacking it in the press since the V for Vendetta's film's release. Though he has subsequently referred to assurances being given and broken promises regarding his Watchmen contract, it's clear that Moore knew full well that verbal agreements were worth the paper they were written on. He was also expert enough in contractual rights prior to signing his Watchmen contract that in 1984, Once he was lucratively employed by DC Comics and assured of forthcoming work, including Watchmen, he was able to surreptitiously and unilaterally deprive his co-creator and equal partner Alan Davis of the revenue and exposure Marvel Comics reprinting their strip Captain Britain in the US would bring, as an act of personal revenge against another individual Davis had no connection with. In the only verifiable instance of cheating, swindling, and stealing of creators' rights involving Moore, he was actually the instigator, and his then closest co-creator was the victim. Prior to Watchmen in 1984, Moore and artist Alan Davis had worked together for 3 years on 6 critically acclaimed series in the UK: Captain Britain, Marvelman, DR and Quinch, Future Shock, Star Wars, and Night Raven. In the summer of 1983, a delegation from US publisher DC came to London to headhunt some of the UK's best talent to work for them, and Moore was amongst those hired. By 1984, he had already secured much more lucrative US Comics works from DC with the monthly Swamp Thing comic and several other DC projects, including one featuring their recently acquired Charlton Comics Company characters, which would become the Watchmen. As his US workload increased, Moore began quitting his considerably poorer paid UK work. Even though his artwork was on most of the stories that got Moore hired by the US, Davis wasn't hired by DC in 1983, despite taking the extremely risky step of quitting his full-time factory job to focus on his comics career. In late 1984, Davis learned that Marvel US wanted to reprint the Captain Britain strips. This would have afforded him both his first exposure in the US comics market, as well as some financial stability in reprint fees. But unbeknownst to him, Moore had secretly killed the deal without discussing it with him or even subsequently informing him. But worse was to come. Despite them speaking regularly at this time in person and over the phone, it was months before Davis learned of Moore's actions in early 1985. To make matters worse, Davis states that he learned it from a mutual friend that the only reason Moore did this was he felt Marvel editor-in-chief Jim Shooter had disrespected him when he visited the US Marvel offices in August 1984. Davis says he was told Shooter said to Moore he wasn't really a fan of his Swamp Thing as it was too Stephen Kingish, and he much preferred his Captain Britain work, which he wanted to reprint. Once Moore returned to the UK and confirmed he had more DC work commissioned, he set about killing the Captain Britain reprints despite Shooter, regardless of the serious collateral damage to his co-creator's livelihood and career. This was an attribute he would use again and again against other co-creators. As bizarre as Davis's account for Moore's petty and cruel actions is, it's the only one that actually stands up to any scrutiny. Publicly, there is a myriad of laudable reasons attributed to Moore by himself and his supporters for opposing the Marvel Captain Britain reprints. Moore has offered 3 very different, factually impossible, explanations in the multiple interviews biographies, where he is always either a victim or a hero. One excuse is that he refused the reprint and quit working for Marvel in solidarity with a colleague who was fired, knowing how that would reflect on Davis, who didn't quit. It's a commendable excuse that he uses in several interviews, telling Lance Parkin in 2013, "As I remember it, when Bernie J was fired, we were both of us filled with young man's testosterone, you know. We both really liked Bernie, and as I remember it, we were both saying, well, that's it for us and Marvel." Unsurprisingly, from a master like Moore, it's an admirable account, which casts him in a noble light and Davis not so much, but it's utterly untrue. The colleague referred to as Bernie J, his and Alan Davis's editor on Captain Britain, and she wasn't fired. J chose to leave the role for other pursuits in November 1983, and this was acknowledged at the time by both Marvel and Moore and Davis, who wrote and illustrated a humorous good luck strip printed by her employers Marvel UK, bemoaning her decision to leave them. Also, Moore did not leave Captain Britain for another 7 months, until June 1984 when he quit all his UK work. Moore subsequently visited Marvel in New York and had an introductory meeting with the editor-in-chief Jim Shooter in August 1984, almost a year after he subsequently claimed to have cut all ties with them, and a month before he wrote to Marvel UK's Robert Sutherland concerning Captain Britain's copyright. Author and authority on Marvel Man, Miracle Man, George Corey, who wrote the Eisner-nominated Commodore in 2001, interviewed Moore and presented another factually impossible excuse. Corey's book stated that in 1984, Marvel were going to print, or did print, Corey's tenses vary in his fictional retelling, some more Doctor Who stories without his consent. And this injustice was the reason that Moore shafted his friend and co-creator. Corey writes, "While a problem arose that would affect the bond between Moore and Davis, by 1984 word had gotten out of Marvel US that a few old Moore Doctor Who stories were to be reprinted, done without his consent. Copyright are extremely different between the United States and England, and it appears that Moore has ownership of his Marvel work and the right to refuse any request in regards to reprinting any work he did for Marvel Comics. Once Marvel Comics did this injustice, Moore's principals would never allow him to work for the company again. Somehow, friction developed between Moore and Davis regarding the Marvel issue. Davis is a more conservative thinker and apparently felt that there was other ways to confront Marvel, but Moore was solid about his position on the issue." None of this was true. Comics historian Corey somehow forgot that Moore had axed Captain Britain without discussing it or informing Davis in late 1984, and that no Alan Moore Doctor Who work was ever reprinted until November 1985. Presumably, Moore forgot to axe that reprint, which was drawn by his V for Vendetta co-creator and co-owner David Lloyd. Corey also forgot that Moore's principals did allow him to work for the company again, just not for Jim Shooter or with Captain Britain. And although Corey had interviewed Alan Davis concerning the rift between him and Moore, he felt it best to excise all of Alan Davis's contributions, apart from his artwork, which he used without Davis's permission, and rely instead on just Moore's account and things that never happened to support Moore's lies in his Eisner-nominated Commodore. Corey sums up Moore's split with Davis as follows. Brighter note, in 1995, Moore relented to the reprinting of the Captain Britain stories as a gesture of friendship to Alan Davis, his first major collaborator. Much brighter, but equally utterly untrue. Moore's other commendable excuse for screwing over his colleague is more complex than the others, but equally false. In several interviews, he claims he refused US Marvel permission to reprint Captain Britain over their insistence, which he saw as bullying, a phrase he likes to use repeatedly against others, that Marvel Man be renamed over Marvel's copyright of the word Marvel. Except Marvel never said the character's name had to be changed. In September 1984, Marvel UK solicitors sent a letter to Des Skin, editor and owner of the UK publishers of Marvel Man in Warrior magazine, instructing them not to use the word Marvel on their covers as it was getting confused in shops with UK Marvel publications with Marvel in their titles. The letter, sent to Quality Publications, the publisher of Warrior, never instructed or even alluded that the character name Marvel Man couldn't be used, as Moore would later fictionally frame it for promotional and publicity purposes. It didn't impact Moore's plans for the character going forward. It just instructed Des Skin's Quality Publications not to produce any new titles with the word Marvel on the cover for UK retail. Moore had actually already quit working for Quality Publications months earlier and despised Skin at the time to the extent of trying to assault and never talk to him again. And this was despite Skin hiring Moore for his dream job, ensuring, whether kosher or not, that Moore had some ownership and profited from Marvel Man's IP. And according to Padraig O'Maloid's comprehensive history of Marvel Man, named Poison Chalice, he lent Moore a sizable amount of money to help him stay in comics. Des Skin confirmed O'Maloid's account to me. I had agreed to lend him a considerable amount of money so he could afford to provide for his family while he struggled to find sufficient work to justify comics as a career. In spite of neither creating or owning the 1950s Marvel Man character, nor even being referenced in the legal letter, Moore says this letter led to him severing all ties with bullying Marvel, including the Captain Britain reprints. Telling biographer George Curry, "It was over the Marvel Man thing that I decided I wouldn't work with any kind of version of Marvel Man in the future." Later, in a 2010 interview with Padraig O'Malley, he even refers to letting Marvel know that this was the reason via a dead witness. Marvel editor Archie Goodwin. "I didn't like it. I didn't like submitting to the bullying, but apparently yes. Archie Goodwin had said, Alan Moore's not going to be working for Marvel in any way, or letting us reprint Captain Britain, unless we ease up on the Marvel Man deal." Several facts undermine Moore's anti-bullying stance as the reason for his ill treatment of his longest-serving colleague and Captain Britain co-creator Alan Davis. Skin, the publisher of Marvel Man, had already decided a year earlier to change the name for the US, having realized on a trip there in 1983 to sell the strip that no publisher, including Marvel, was interested in publishing a comic with the confusing Marvel in the title. If any publisher was responsible for the name change from Marvel Man to Miracle Man, it wasn't Marvel. It was in fact the US comics publisher Pacific Comics, who were originally going to reprint it in the US. And Moore was aware of this for almost a year before Marvel UK's solicitor letters were sent to Des Skin's Quality Publications. Despite all of Moore's public abhorrence of Marvel's bullying, while publicizing the relaunch or excusing his treatment of Alan Davis or just attacking Marvel, he never once reached out to Skin, who was the only person to receive the letters, for clarification or details, or to offer his support to the only person contacted in any way, shape, or form by Marvel. Skin recalls, "I have to confess to being disappointed that Alan Moore offered no support whatsoever when I received the Marvel UK letters. Whatever his personal feelings were at the time, this was such a high-profile property which affected the income of others than himself. Ironically, the name change to Miracle Man was in fact Moore's own idea. In his original pitch for Marvel Man in 1981 to Skin, he suggested changing the title to Miracle Man should any copyright issues arise, or if they were unable to secure permission to revamp the character from his original creator and owner Mick Anglo. Moore's Archie Goodwin tale doesn't stand up to any scrutiny, though sadly Goodwin was no longer able to give his own account when Moore used him to validate his own. As was pointed out in the comic section of the website that ran this story twice, Heidi MacDonald's The Beat, Robert Stanley Martin wrote in the comments, "I actually think it's worse that you're printing gossip-based attack on people without checking things out with those who have first-hand knowledge of the situation. However, if you want to be irresponsible and spread misinformation, I suppose that's your call. And if Heidi MacDonald wants to print it, that's on her." And Martin was correct. Most definitive or authoritative accounts of events surrounding Moore, the only person whose account is promoted is that of Moore's, often by excising or ignoring the testimony of others, or in the case of the late Archie Goodwin, being used as a silent prop in Moore's fantastical account. The simple verifiable facts are Captain Britain wasn't part of Archie Goodwin's editorial turf, and he would know the trademark issue wasn't Shooter's call. Goodwin would also know it was Marvel president James Galton who was the only person at Marvel who could have any influence in the matter. Moore's defamatory account also depends on accepting that Moore, who had just a year earlier contacted the relevant UK Copyrights Department of US Marvel or Marvel UK's Robert Sutherland to secretly cancel any Captain Britain reprints in advance, felt that telling an editor who had nothing to do with the Marvel Man issue and no reason to be involved was better than contacting the folks he'd previously secretly dealt with for his Captain Britain permission rights. As for his noble vow to never work for Marvel again in any way, shape, or form, it turns out that wasn't true either. Moore went on to do exactly what he states he never did, and worked for Marvel's Epic magazine in November 1985. His clandestine actions, which could have destroyed his closest co-creator's career, were personal, petty, and against a single individual, Jim Shooter, who Moore later referred to as Führer, despite only meeting him once and never working for him. But like his career, Moore's screwing over of co-creators was only just beginning. It was in early 1985, the same time as he was signing the Watchmen contract, that Moore facilitated the actual swindling and theft of Alan Davis's work. At that time, Davis says he still considered him a good friend. They had spoken several times since he had quit his UK titles, with Moore recommending his best friend from school, Jamie Delano, to take over writing Captain Britain. They spoke about working for DC, US page rates, and in all that time Moore never mentioned cancelling the US Captain Britain reprints. As soon as Davis found out, he phoned Moore, asking him to reconsider or at the very least explain himself. According to Davis, Moore tried to justify his actions with rambling nonsense he knew wasn't true. He'd heard directly from Moore's pal Delano, who actually collected Moore from his New York Jim Shooter meeting trip and drove him home, that it was over a perceived Jim Shooter snub. Davis told Moore to undo the damage he'd done. That was the last time Moore ever spoke to him, Davis says, which is another common experience with his co-creators. And Moore carried on launching the series Miracle Man, that they were currently co-creators on and held equal rights and ownership to. Davis felt he only had one recourse, to show Moore the effect refusing permission to reprint had on a co-creator. Just before Miracle Man was due to be published in the US, Davis sent him 2 letters to his home, by both standard and registered post. Registered post means it has to be signed for by the recipient. This was July 1985. He told Moore he was refusing any and all permission for any of his Marvel Man artwork to be reprinted, as well as any of the characters he had designed to be used in future issues. Davis made clear he had not signed any contract with Eclipse, the US publishers, allowing them to reprint his work, and he still genuinely believed at this stage, with one reprint in limbo and another one about to join it because of Moore's actions, that Alan would back down. At that time, I still thought he was a friend who was acting like a temperamental child. I never thought he was capable of what he subsequently did. Davis's letters, by way of an olive branch and solution to the impasse, pointed specifically to Moore's own refusal of the Captain Britain reprints as the sole cause for his own reciprocation, unequivocally making it clear that Alan Moore could resolve the standoff he'd created. Moore ignored the letters, though the fact that it was registered proves he received it, and despite knowing that Davis had refused permission and wasn't being paid a penny, worked on, wrote new material for, and promoted all of the Miracle Man issues featuring Davis's stolen artwork. And he even wrote new stories featuring the characters Alan Davis had designed. Years later, when Moore had wrapped up his Miracle Man story, having been paid and received some royalties for all the issues that Davis also worked on, featuring the characters that he co-created without any payment, he gave the series and Davis's co-created characters to his friend Neil Gaiman to continue. In his own origin story, anarchist Moore always blames others, which is another constant in Moore's recollection of any events that could possibly reflect negatively on him. He blames the editor and publisher of Miracle Man, stating that they somehow tricked him into thinking Davis had happily signed a contract, committing to the exact opposite of what he personally informed Moore he was doing, and why. While the publishers Eclipse dubiously claimed that they had a contract from Skin allowing them to reprint the series, the truth remains that Moore was the only person in the process who knew that no such contract had been or even would be signed by Davis. Exactly why Davis refused any reprint or use of his Marvel Man work, how to redress him, and Moore was the only person on Earth who could do so. For decades subsequently, Moore has lied about this and defamed others, including Davis himself. In an interview with Kurth Macker in 2009, Moore says, "They had made certain promises to me that I wanted to be absolutely sure that the artist at the time, Alan Davis, was happy about his work being reprinted. And I told them I could not commence writing any new work until they had got that affirmation. They finally left it until the last minute, and then asked me why I hadn't got the new Marvel Man work in, at which point I reiterated my request for some proof that Alan Davis was okay about the whole thing. They said they were getting this proof, and they really needed me to start work. that this proof existed, that it was on its way, and they would be showing it to me as soon as possible. I started work because I believed they were telling the truth. I later found out this was not the case. Speaking to Pádraig Ó Maolóid in 2010, Moore states, I wanted something on paper that said Alan Davis was okay with everything. And they promised me faithfully that they had got this paperwork or they were getting it. And if I could just start writing, then they would be getting it to me. They never got it to me because it didn't exist. And I felt that Alan Davis had probably felt that I was party to screwing him, which was not the case and was regrettable. In yet another interview, this time with Lance Parkin in 2013, he decided to insult Davis, making his own failed attempts to avoid screwing him all the more admirable. By this time, I was mired with Eclipse. I wasn't in contact with Alan Davis, and I was totally at the mercy of what I was being told by Eclipse editors Kat Uranwood and Dean Mullaney. Genuinely, the reason I was sticking over delivering new work to Eclipse was because, while I didn't much like Alan Davis at that point, and I thought he was a bit of a grumpy person who I hadn't got any interest in talking to again, I didn't want him to be cheated. I didn't want anyone to be cheated. Even though Moore doesn't elaborate on why he felt the need to demean his co-creator, other than to make himself all the more noble in his fruitless efforts to stop Davis being cheated whilst knowingly cheating him, Moore's supporters can now at least understand why Alan Davis might have been a bit grumpy. Unlike Moore, who has given dozens of interviews about his travails, Davis only consented to speak about the events now, as he says he was surprised someone finally figured it out. He contributed interviews and materials to both Pádraig Ó Maolóid and George Curry's books, but he found out later his responses had been edited by the authors without his knowledge or permission, so as not to offend or cast Moore in a bad light. Moore's much defamed editor, Catherine Uranwood, replied to the author Pádraig Ó Maolóid in the comments section of Heidi MacDonald's The Beat's website, denying Alan Moore's account ever happened and explaining in comprehensive detail why it possibly couldn't have. Pádraig Ó Maolóid diligently ignored her detailed dismissal, and he supported Moore's lies in his published book. Contrary to all the other parties' proof, as, he says, he didn't like her, despite never meeting or interviewing her. I recently asked Ó Maolóid over Twitter, who interviewed both Moore and Davis for the comprehensive book on Miracle Man, A Poisoned Chalice, why he didn't focus on any of the facts revealed to him by Davis or Catherine Uranwood that reflected negatively on Moore. Ó Maolóid responded that the reason he blamed others, didn't confront or even correct Moore, was he didn't want to disagree with him, and he wouldn't report any damaging facts about people who are friends of mine in his supposedly factually comprehensive book. Moore has now cut off all contact with his friend over something he wrote. Although Ó Maolóid admits he doesn't know what, he didn't want to upset Moore by disagreeing with him. For someone who has repeatedly hailed his own false travails against bullying, Moore has an extremely long history of employing it, especially against those who don't have his means or stock with the media to defend themselves. Davis's treatment was the most egregious, but his Swamp Thing and John Constantine, and also Inspiration Between DR and Quinch series, co-creator and former friend Steve Bissett says Moore won't allow a creator-owned series he wrote, 1963, which almost a dozen others worked on and would benefit from, be reprinted purely to spite Bissett. As a penciler on Swamp Thing, Bissett was one of Moore's first US co-creators. He even hosted Moore in his home on Moore's very first US trip. Without Bissett, two of Moore's most lucrative creator-owned works might not exist. He commissioned and funded Moore and artist Eddie Campbell and Moore's future wife Melinda Gebbie to produce From Hell and Lost Girls for his own anthology magazine Taboo. From Hell, one of Moore's most popular works with artist Eddie Campbell, in particular owes its existence to the fact that Bissett turned down an initial submission by Moore, a sardonically comedic piece. Bissett states it didn't fit Taboo's more extreme horror genre goals. Bissett recalls his role in the genesis of From Hell. He proposed and even made the icebreaker initial phone call to Campbell as the artist for the project. Even after the project moved on to other publishers, Bissett still supported it, After From Hell's legal situation and publishing commitments became hopelessly tangled and vanished from Moore's mind, it wasn't Moore but Bissett who encouraged Eddie Campbell to regain control and ownership to reprint the work. Despite his midwifery, Bissett never received nor ever sought any of the millions of dollars those works generated. He took pains to ensure the creators of the work he commissioned had full ownership and rights. But when it came to reprinting 1963, which both Moore and Bissett worked on and owned, with almost a dozen other creators, Moore refused permission. Apparently, he has never clarified, which is a common occurrence. He objected to something Bissett said in an interview which Bissett courteously sent him in advance for any corrections, revisions, or deletions he might consider necessary before publishing, which was a courtesy Bissett extended to almost everyone mentioned in the interview. Moore didn't respond and told Bissett he never wanted to speak to him again. Constantly described by his supporters and himself as deeply and morally principled, Moore, true to his anarchist beliefs, turned the other cheek in light of Bissett's interview, and then he turned it back again. Not to contradict or even correct Bissett, but to do everything he could publicly and punitively to damage Bissett. And as a consequence, several other creators who played no part in whatsoever anything that was said that offended Moore. By punishing Bissett for an unknown transgression, all the dozen or so other artists and contributors are collateral in Moore's revenge, denied any reprint exposure, fees, and royalties, while Moore continues to reap the benefit from those two creator-owned series Bissett commissioned and paid Moore for, all the way to this day. Amongst those denied an income, a 1963 reprint would bring are Dave Gibbons, Rick Veitch, John Toddleben, Don Simpson, Chester Brown, Jim Valentino, Roxanne Starr, and industry veteran Murphy Anderson, who did all the production and color separations to epitomize the Marvel Comics color and printing appearance of the 60s. Anderson was a Golden Age great. He embellished some of the most memorable DC covers of the period, and primarily aimed Curt Swan's pencils, a team-up earning them the Swanderson moniker. Aside from his iconic art, Anderson was a technical innovator who renovated DC's production, separation, and printing processes to better reflect his colleagues' and peers' artwork. Anderson worked on the separations and film production of every issue of 1963, and he was due remunerations from any reprints using his work. Murphy Anderson died in 2015, after Moore had twice cancelled reprinting the series out of spite against Bissett. Moore's own words, "This is the gangster ethics that I was just talking about after seeing great creators going to their graves, cheated and disillusioned." Artist Rick Veitch revealed in an interview with the Comics Cube in November 2020 that Moore suffered a self-induced mini-nervous breakdown after experimenting with psychedelic drugs towards the end of the 1963 project, and he disappeared for weeks without any explanation to his co-creators, who were awaiting scripts to meet publishing deadlines. Bissett, however, never referred to or revealed this, but actually stated in the Comics Journal interview that Moore seemed at times to disregard the 1963 projects and his friends and fellow creators and co-owners, while he managed to write single-issue work-for-hire scripts for six-figure sums. This is what Bissett believes Moore ended their friendship over, and is punitively punishing him and all the other creators, even though it's true. Moore is also preventing Bissett from reprinting anything they both own that they worked on together, such as the acclaimed Mirror of Love, which Bissett co-created with Moore and Rick Veitch. After Moore denied the 1963 creators permission to reprint their work in 1998, in 2003 Top Shelf approached Bissett and Veitch on Moore's behalf for permission to rework the Mirror of Love with another artist. In the interest of fostering good relations, both agreed. Moore produced a new prestige edition with visuals by Jose Villarrubia in hardcover and softcover and multiple languages, which excised all of Veitch and Bissett's credits and any royalties from the new adaptation of their work. Though Moore conceived and wrote Mirror of Love specifically as an 8-page comic strip, he's been happy to participate with its adaptation into a play, musical, theater, book of photographs, despite his publicly avowed principled hatred of comics adaptations. After the new Mirror of Love deal, Veitch and Bissett approached publisher Dynamite about reprinting 1963, with the understanding that Moore would allow it, but without his name appearing anywhere in connection to it. In 2009, after thousands of dollars had been spent scanning in the artwork and commissioning a brand new Alex Ross cover, Moore changed his mind and decided at the last minute to kill the reprint without giving any reason or explanation. While Moore now claims he quit working for DC over the Watchmen contract, and this retroactive version of history has been bolstered by all his supporters, sycophantic journalists, reporters, biographers, and interviewers, this is untrue. He very publicly and very famously at the time quit working for DC in 1987 over a proposed labeling rating system that subsequently wasn't even introduced. Moore even spoke in glowing terms about his Watchmen contract, as well as its possible adaptations into other media, in a proposal for a new series for DC called Twilight in late 1986, which DC turned down shortly before Moore quit working for them, apparently over an unrelated matter. Moore wrote, "Ideally, it might be even possible, while appealing to the die-hard superhero junkie, to produce a central story idea, simple, powerful, and resonant enough to bear translation to other media. I mean, I know that I'm probably still intoxicated by the Watchmen deal, but it never hurts to allow for these things as a possibility, does it?" Subsequently, DC, under pressure publicly from a censor-happy political and public caucus, announced it was introducing a rating system for its title, and Moore used this as an excuse to quit, writing in the Comics Buyer's Guide in February 1987, "With the conclusion of the work that I am actually contracted to do, I shall be producing other work in the future for any publisher imposing a rating system upon its creators and readers." Even though DC did not adopt the rating system, something still caused Moore to cease working for the company that just turned down his self-described merchandise and media-friendly Twilight proposal. In a later interview with the Comics Journal in November 1987, Moore stated, "DC reiterated their stance upon the rating system, which seemed to me to indicate they had no intention of changing their position. And when that became clear, I simply quit. It was as simple as that. I certainly didn't want at any point to indulge in any form of moral terrorism." In 1991, he repeated this, and even conceded that his Watchmen contract facilitated his being able to quit. "I don't own Watchmen. I don't own V for Vendetta. I don't own Marvel Man. I don't own Swamp Thing. I get royalties from it, but that's a pretty recent innovation. Watchmen has made me hundreds of thousands of pounds, but that's not a fraction of what DC made out of it. I'm one of the lucky ones. I'm somebody who became famous and has got enough financial clout to have some say in what they did with their lives." Subsequently, Moore would go on to create and publish his own magazine, Dodgem Logic, with "For Adults Only" emblazoned on the cover, as the rules that he insists everyone else follow don't apply to him. Moore even returned to working with DC when the independent company he was producing the line of America's Best Comics for. 15 years after Watchmen, he was still happily signing work-for-hire contract after contract, creating comics and characters his publisher owned. Wildstorm was bought by DC. In 2000, 13 years after he currently claims to have quit DC over Watchmen rights, Moore was still working directly for DC to promote new 15th anniversary editions of the Watchmen collection, ensuring an even greater extended publication life and spin-off merchandise and toys, with his blessing and improved profit participation. In a 2000 interview with Newsarama, he clarified this. "Legally, DC doesn't need my approval to bring out toys or anything like that. They own the book and they have exercised that option in the past 15 years. But shortly before this Watchmen 15th anniversary marketing campaign could happen, DC angered him, and it had nothing to do with contracts or creators' rights or even Watchmen. Shortly before the launch of the Watchmen 15th anniversary campaign, DC decided not to publish, as was their right according to the contracts Moore agreed to, a Cobweb story, inspired and illustrated by his then-girlfriend, now-wife, Melinda Gebbie, in Tomorrow Stories number 8, featuring Scientology founder L. Ron Hubbard. It was only after this perceived very personal snub that Moore adopted the deliberately emotive narrative that DC had stolen Watchmen and V for Vendetta from him. Since then, he's used the media publicity around any high-profile DC Warner release of his work, which, again, he happily signed contracts repeatedly for, to attack, insult, and defame his employers, peers, audience, and even friends, regardless of the financial or reputational consequences for his co-creators, who don't share his very personal grudges or his considerable income. To justify his public flaying of fellow creators, Moore realized that creative rights was a far more noble whip to wield than revenge over the refusal to print his then girlfriend's work, as per the contract that they had both signed. The only creator's rights that matter and have ever mattered to Moore are his own. His bibliography illuminates as much. He started his career using characters created by others. Even his Watchmen pitch was intended to feature obscure characters created by others, but DC balked at the tone and insisted on new, original pastiches. Post-Watchmen, for over 30 years, he almost exclusively signed lucrative work-for-hire contract after contract, featuring other creators' characters, and even his most recent self-owned work has featured a myriad of historical fictional characters created by other authors, though Moore does not recognize or even acknowledge the original creators. Despite his repeated attack on adaptations of his work, he actually now states adaptations from one medium to the other doesn't work. He has had no problem adapting others' work from one medium into comics without any reference or acknowledgement of the author, or with his own adaptations of the comic strip Mirror of Love, or adapting the Bill Sienkiewicz illustrated brought to light into a spoken word piece, or even Big Numbers into a proposed television series, not to mention H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, which Moore adapted from start to finish for the second series of his League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, again forgetting and whitewashing Wells' contribution. Of course, Moore also famously sold the rights to two of his creator-owned books, From Hell and League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. The fact is that for all the kudos and credit Moore receives over his very public, principled objections to adaptations, they actually only apply where DC Comics will profit from them. Moore has sold or approved adaptations of almost every comic he co-owns, including League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, From Hell, Brought to Light, Big Numbers, and Mirror of Love, despite his principled objections to adaptations of comics into any other media. Meanwhile, he incandescently rages, demeans, and defames anyone who works on the characters he co-created, sold, and continues to be paid for. He attacks and insults anyone who works on Watchmen spin-offs, as his contract allows. The likes of Joe Kubert, John Higgins, Len Wein, Darwin Cook, Adam Hughes, Amanda Connor, and others were portrayed by him as immoral, talentless scabs, and thrown to the horde of Moore fans and media, and even their more gullible peers who regurgitate his lies like a mantra. Specifically, Moore said of the before Watchmen creators, "What's the word? I don't want to use creators. I feel that the industry employees who are actually working upon this book, I had only heard of about 3 of them, but I am certainly not interested in seeing any of their work. But I'm likely to because I don't read comics anymore and they're never going to do anything outside of comics. I can see why the people concerned are involved, having either never created anything original themselves or, if they did, it certainly wasn't good. If DC want to soil themselves in public and kill the reputations of a number of otherwise possibly halfway decent writers and artists, then I'm certainly not going to stop them. And I shall take my fun and my pleasure however it comes." At exactly this time in 2012, Moore was working on a new series of League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, featuring characters whose creators he's whitewashed from existence, and he was researching a work-for-hire sequel to a popular series created by Garth Ennis called Crossed. Moore's derogatory comments about creators, essentially doing what he did all his career, were echoed and amplified by his supporters, including many of his peers in comic media outlets, in spite of the blatant hypocrisy and particularly petty and dismissive language used. In an interview with Rolling Stone, the late Darwin Cook, one of those creators, said, "I've read some pretty nasty things said about myself. For example, I can deal with that. There are times when I wish some of these guys, because I think some of them know better, I wish they would take a moment and stop and think. And instead of referring to a man like Joe Kubert as a scab or a disgrace, you might want to stop for a minute and think, with this diverse group of talent involved with the project, maybe there is more to the story than they know." Sadly, the self-perpetuated false victimization of Moore still persists to this day. The comic industry he loathes made Moore a millionaire. He was amongst the highest paid writers in the industry. He made a small fortune just from selling his own film options and receives more in royalties in retirement than most of his co-creators put together. Enjoying a modest, frugal lifestyle, Moore, unlike most of his co-creators, never needs to work or worry about money again. And this was before his latest Bloomsbury multi-book deal was announced. He can easily afford to use his own creators' rights to stop reprints and their income to punish co-creators he deems have transgressed against, regardless of who else suffers as a consequence. In Pictopia is considered by some to be Moore's finest work. It was a creator-owned 13-page comic strip produced for a charity fundraiser, written by Moore and illustrated by artist Don Simpson, with assistance from Mike Kasla, Pete Poplaski, and Eric Vincent. It was a heartfelt, poignant, and terrifying tale of the familiar archetypal denizens of a comic book city, a premise Moore would later revisit without co-creator Simpson years later with his top 10 comic for DC. His income seriously impacted by the COVID pandemic, Don Simpson was approached in 2020 by publisher Fantagraphics to reprint In Pictopia in its own book. Moore, however, won't allow his In Pictopia co-creator to use his name on the project or to promote or support it, because he didn't like a critique Fantagraphics published in a magazine in the 90s. Simpson says, Allen gave his reasons for not wanting his name on the book as not wanting to be associated with Fantagraphics. This stemmed from something negative written about him in the Comics Journal in the 1990s. How a negative sentence or two could outweigh the overwhelmingly glowing praise for Allen's work in the comics press back in the 20th century boggles my mind, but he still holds that resentment. It's even more boggling as Moore is not shy when it comes to critiquing others, their work, or even his own critics themselves. It seems as with everything else in Moore's anarchic world, based on equality, there is one rule for him and another for everyone else. Don Simpson worked through the pandemic at a local factory night job to make ends meet, while Moore still collects royalties from the top 10 series their work together inspired. The gangster and corrupt corporations that he rails against for stealing, swindling, and driving creators to an early grave demonstrably treat creators far better than Moore does. It was the lawyers representing Marvel Comics' legal department who recognized and addressed all the legal costs around Moore's Miracle Man, remunerated Marvel Man's frail elderly creator Mick Anglo, co-creator Alan Davis, and Gary Leach, and all the other talents who were involved. Watchmen and V for Vendetta owner DC Comics pays the 1963 talent better royalties on their DC work than the work they actually own and co-created with Moore. Both Marvel and DC acknowledge and credit the original creators of their characters, while Moore, who owns and has complete creative control over his most recent works, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and Lost Girls, doesn't recognize any of the creators of the central characters he uses. In every single instance where Moore can dictate it, he is the only author credited in his work centered on other authors' characters. There isn't even a thanks to the original creators of Jekyll and Hyde or Captain Nemo, Professor Moriarty, Alice, Wendy, and Dorothy. Despite the premise of these books, the history, characterization, promotion, and even some of the sales of P.S. new works being dependent on their creations, he doesn't afford them any recognition in any of his dozens of published editions. They are deliberately forgotten, and any contribution to Moore's own work erased. Len Wein, who gave Moore his first US work, and in fact the comic he himself had created, Swamp Thing, was subsequently dismissed by Moore as a plagiarist and described as a regurgitator of what was a lame character after Wein had signed on to work on before Watchmen. Amongst the most prominent creators who made his career that he's defamed is V for Vendetta artist David Lloyd, who has been described in interviews by Moore as an ungrateful, insulting hypocrite. Moore has several interviews to reveal his financial generosity towards some of his co-creators regarding his film option monies, though the benevolence is undermined by how in the very same interviews he then uses this fact to demean and attack them. In an interview with Time Out magazine's Dominic Wells in 2016, Moore says of the V for Vendetta film adaptation's ubiquitous Guy Fawkes masks, "I don't want anything to do with it. Take my name off and give all the money to the wretched David Lloyd. And that includes all the merchandise as well. David Lloyd, who gets all the money from those masks. Even though Moore never actually wrote any sequence akin to that famous one featuring the masks in the film adaptation's climax, and the masks are purely the concept and work of V for Vendetta artist David Lloyd, Moore still likes to take credit for bestowing the royalties to his partner. Except David Lloyd recalls none of that principled benevolence regarding the film's mask merchandising being true. Even his most famous co-creator, Watchmen artist Dave Gibbons, has been painted by Moore as an unscrupulous, disloyal, and greedy. Moore's last public comments on his most prominent co-creator and friend for over 3 decades come from the same interview with Wells. Dave Gibbons: I hope I never see that effer for as long as I live. Moore has been so successful at employing his fictional revamping in real life, he's not even making much of an effort in his extraordinary excuses, and they're still accepted by the media and his supporters. His most recent paranoid conspiracy-level defamation against his friend and Watchmen co-creator Dave Gibbons actually involves flat Earth-level conjecture. A dead friend, the deceased friend's dying relative, supervillainous machinations by DC, and pantomime dialogue that any other writer would be embarrassed to use. Gibbons has denied Moore's account of their breakup ever happened. Regardless of all the available evidence, it contradicts Moore's varying versions of events, the actual facts that make a lie of his accounts, the stance of his equal co-creators, and the openness with which Moore indulges in the actual practices he falsely condemns others for. His supporters still believe him and propagate his attacks on his innocent peers for the pettiest of personal vendettas, whether imagined or illogical or manufactured, and given all the respectability of fake news by the individuals and organs that regurgitate them. While the more objective observers might imagine Moore's supporters aren't influenced by his more extreme fatwas, a series of tweets by professional comics letterer Jim Campbell exemplifies the mindset of many of Moore's supporters. In September 2020, Forbidden Planet UK released a variant cover for Rorschach issue 1 by comics legend and Moore co-creator Brian Boland. Campbell took the opportunity to follow Moore's lead and defame not just Boland, but everyone who had ever worked on or produced a variant cover on a Watchmen spin-off. F anyone who participates in this blatant IP theft by DC. If your paycheck is so important that you'll sanction this absolute robbery, F you, he continued. But if other creators didn't line up to help massive corporations F over other creators, well, that would be nice, wouldn't it? Campbell, either willfully or blissfully ignorant of the fact that Moore didn't need the help of massive corporations to F over other creators throughout his career, later deleted those tweets, and then subsequently reiterated that he stood by everything he said. Amongst those, Campbell and presumably Moore, accused of theft, are Moore's co-creators Brian Boland, Bill Sienkiewicz, John Higgins, P. Craig Russell, Kevin Nolan, and Bruce Timm. Moore, who in fairness also describes pretty much everyone who worked on Watchmen except for himself as thieves, also suggested his co-creators, along with the likes of Len Wein, Neil Adams, Jim Steranko, Joe Kubert, Jose Garcia Lopez, and Darwin Cook, as having either never created anything original themselves, or if they did, but it wasn't good. These creators' crime was to work on characters co-created by Moore. Characters who would have been Charlton or Archie characters, some of whom Moore proposed killing and raping without regard to their original creators' wishes, until a DC editor suggested he use archetypes so as not to destroy the brands and get himself a better deal in rights and royalties. Although his supporters like Jim Campbell all point to Moore's cherishing of creators' rights, in spite of his repeated victimization, as the reason for his constant attacks on the medium industry, friends and fans that made him, the only thing that he has actually held dearly throughout his career is petty personal grudges. For all his claims of being the victim of liars, bullies, thieves, and swindlers, the only actual examples that the facts support are where he's the pathological liar, the defamatory bully, or the perpetrator of fraud and theft. Later this year, thanks to Moore signing a deal with J.K. Rowling's publisher Bloomsbury, a collection of his prose work, Illuminations, will be published and will be treated to another slew of poor Alan Moore articles and interviews. In spite of Bloomsbury's considerable investment in Moore's solo ventures into a new medium, His most acclaimed and ubiquitous work remains those in collaboration with equally talented co-creators. As a writer, Moore is a genius, but as a person, he's a narcissistic, paranoid, vindictive individual. More pertinently, as an advocate or figurehead for principled, ethical, and moral creators' rights, he's the epitome of hypocrisy, who has attacked and defamed his co-creators, their work, and industry over the most banal of slights or consequences of his own actions. So the next time you read any Illuminations-inspired article or interview with Moore involving lying, swindling, gangster ethics, cheated creators, bullying, and stealing, spare a thought for Alan Davis or the 1963 co-creators, or all the artists he attacked and defamed, from Gibbons and Lloyd to the before Watchmen teams, or even the creators of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen characters, all left in the dark, while Moore shines the spotlight on himself. If you've enjoyed or appreciated this investigation, please click one of those button things like subscribe or like or the bell or something like that, just so you'll be informed when the next article goes up. I have about 2, maybe 3 more that I want to get through, and I promise you they're much shorter and much more recent than this one. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen.